So this is officially it's called the guidance for participants and those facilitating sessions. First of all, let's start off with an idea of what philosophy is, or at least what I can say philosophy is in like 90 seconds. The actual term philosophy from the Greek means love of wisdom. A friend of mine, Joel, who runs some London Zoom groups, he describes it as thinking about thinking. And another helpful way of thinking about it is that philosophy is the clarification of concepts for the purpose of the critical evaluation of beliefs. But the main thing I want to get over here is that philosophy is mostly about ideas. There's some general areas of philosophy. So if you were to study it, you might study aesthetics to do with beauty, epistemology to do with knowledge, ethics and politics, logic, metaphysics broadly about what is, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of religion. Very often people send us questions which perhaps might be more like science, history, politics questions, etc. And as a rule of thumb, you can say that the main difference is that philosophy is about concepts and ideas and not generally about facts or empirical data. Now I'm going to stop sharing and welcome comments from everybody. Have you got any comments what's been said so far? Just speak, please. Dave?
Okay, well, I'm not sure whether philosophy should be completely detached from any kind of physical data. I mean, there are certain forms of philosophy, like metaphysics kind of thing, where if you're describing physical reality, it's often difficult to make reference to physical reality to describe it because you're kind of begging the question, basically, yeah? But there are all kinds of other areas of philosophy, for example, like ethics, where I think it would be very difficult to have a discussion without reference to some kind of empirical data, or certainly facilitate a discussion. I mean, we all like to think in fairly sort of abstract terms, but quite often we need to kind of ground them in some kind of framework of reality for it to have any sort of actual sense even within the confines of the discussion.
I think this is mostly trying to demarcate the kind of question that you would resolve through scientific means, and one of which you resolve through philosophical means. And this is really the point of this discussion we're having now, is to help guide people what counts as a philosophy discussion. To my mind, something that can be settled empirically is probably not a philosophical question, but you're quite right, Dave. Philosophy doesn't happen in a vacuum, and philosophy generally has to pay attention in general to most of the background ideas. For example, no philosopher today would philosophize about a flat world, because we kind of pretty much see ourselves on an almost spherical world in a solar system. But if something is answerable by looking at data, the chances are it's not a philosophy question. So if you said, what percentage of people own 90% of the wealth or something, that is a question that's answered by data rather than concepts.
But do you need any kind of background in philosophy to attend this, these sessions? I mean, are the hosts themselves kind of versed in philosophy?
This one is. Generally, I think what is good about philosophy is that you can do it just by thinking. You don't have to study a great deal, although clearly some people will have studied. But philosophy to me is about clear thinking, rather than having known a lot of philosophers' names and so on. I have studied and taught a bit of philosophy in my time, and quite a few people who attend have. Yeah, that's helpful, David. I don't know. Somebody called G has their hand up.
Yeah. So two questions following on from both your comments and then Dave's comments. The first one, coming back to your point about ethics being one of the parts of philosophy. So are all ethical questions part of philosophy, or is there some sort of Venn diagram where the question type will spill over into a non-philosophical question, Or
Well,
does,
for
does all
example, if you to ask, is it wrong to eat meat on a Friday? I personally wouldn't regard that as part of the philosophy of ethics. To me, the kind of ethic questions are about the logic of ethics, how ethics are justified, and so on. So rather than saying, oh, it's naughty to, it's poor manners or something to eat badly at the table. You know what I mean? These are kind of these are normal. But say why why something is considered wrong? Is it to do with its consequences? Is it to do with its intent? Those are the sort of ideas of ethics that philosophy deals with. And also, what is the best life to live? This kind of thing.
Yeah. So the second question was following up on the last point you made, which is, so if philosophy is about, or part of the reason of philosophy is about thinking clearly, what then is the overlap between philosophy and critical thinking?
I didn't realize they were necessarily different things, to be honest. I would say that almost...
But there are elements of critical thinking that would break your premise of dealing with facts, right? Answering your question with facts. Well, I mean, a lot of critical thinking stems from trying to make science as clear and as precise as possible, right? So elements of critical thinking are coming down to how do we decide what evidence is appropriate for answering a particular question, etc. And that's going to bring in quite a lot of thinking about what facts are we talking about, what empirical data might be. So coming back to your original point of trying to distance philosophy from something that might be a traditional physics question or an economics question or something like that.
Well, that kind of question, Mr. G, sounds like philosophy of science to me. It's saying what is the best method of science to use, or see, if it's something that can be solved by looking at the facts, it's not particularly philosophy, but it can be science. But if you're saying what is the best way, for example, something like the wave particle debate, where the facts aren't clear, or is it thinking about it, and what is the best way to interpret it, that to me seems something that would be part of philosophy of science. Ben, you've got your hand up. Sorry, did I answer your question, G?
Yeah. I'm just trying to tease out the grey between.
I mean, these I'm making generalizations which are very broad.
Oh, absolutely.
And also trying to say things in quite an economical way in quite a short time. Ben, go on.
Yeah, just in a sentence. I mean, you may be sort of covering this, but I mean, as it relates to the kind of things we discuss in these meetups, I mean, in practice, being too hardline and purist about it is not. I mean, it's good to make the distinction in people's minds, but very often the issues being discussed are a mixture of, as it were, pure and applied philosophy. So they're about what the theoretical issue is, but also how it's applied to particular issues or particular cases. So it can't be too dry if it's too applied in too much of a theoretical manner.
My personal inclination is we can talk about things that are current and so on, or might involve politics or economics, but as soon as people start quoting data in a way to answer that kind of question, it ceases to be a philosophical one. So if we're talking about, shall we say, the concepts of universal basic income, is it fair or something, that could be a philosophical one. Perhaps other aspects might be actually more economics than philosophy.
Well, that's true, but yeah, I agree. In theory, one can distinguish the two, try and distinguish the two sharply. But I say in practice, the two are mixed up in the topics that are discussed, and actually that makes it more interesting. I would argue, if you try and keep it completely pure, it gets very dry, and also I think a lot of people can't really understand the distinction always. I just want to say that. So my view is, for these discussions, for the discussion of these, as long as they include philosophy, and as long as the topics are broadly philosophy, that's fine. But it doesn't mean they have to be just philosophy, because I think it's always mixed up with other things.
Okay, I'm keeping an eye on the time. I'm basically allowing about 10 minutes a section here. So I'm going back to the share screen, which I don't think I'll actually see your hands up when I'm sharing the screen. So what I'll do is I'll read bits out, and then I'll come back and see, hands up and things like this. So Now I've got some questions here. It's a bit of fun. Did my best Cilla Black impersonation there. Was it her who said things like this? So I've got a bunch of questions here, and most of these are ones that have been sent in or people have put, if not necessarily on the Monday Zoom, at similar kinds of things, and wondering which ones may be philosophical, which ones may be general. So I'll give you a minute or two to look at these. Let's see if I can, I'm not quite sure what I can and can't see, quite honestly. Actually, let's go through them, okay? What about the first one? I don't mind if people just shout out, actually, because I can't actually, it's not easy for me to see everybody when I'm sharing the screen. But the first one.
It's an interesting question, but it seems very kind of practical. So in fact, it's interesting to talk about, but it's not purely philosophical to me, especially if you've got options and data and stuff.
Yeah, I sort of back up on David's point that it seems to be something that would be, I think, yeah. So to me, it sounds more like a general question rather than a philosophical question.
What about the next one on the same general topic? What do you think about that one?
Yes, I think that could very meaningfully be a philosophical question, because it's looking at basically ideas of what constitutes an ethical decision as opposed to a practical one, which I think is a perfectly worthy subject for philosophical requirement, as opposed to the other one, what is the best way to avoid climate change? There are various disciplines that could meaningfully be discussed within, but I don't think philosophy is one of them.
Okay, so next question, is the Earth the only planet in the galaxy with a technologically advanced civilization? Which is a very popular question a couple of weeks ago, by the way, but do you think it was philosophical?
Well, because it's going into the realm of imagination, you could argue that it's partly philosophical, but ideally it will be a more practical, data-based answer. I'm inclined to think it's like half and half.
I don't want to seem as if I'm just backing up David and everything, but I kind of agree with what he's saying, because so far we have no data really outside of the absence of data to make any sort of reasoned argument about this that falls into that data point. So I would say you'd have to be thinking of it in an almost a sort of, I don't know what the word I'm looking for, a guesswork pattern. I don't know. I'm struggling with my words here.
Well, the problem with that one from a philosophical point of view is the fact that there is actually an answer to that question. We just don't happen to know what it is, basically. Given the right kind of technology, we could, in fact, explore all the planets in the solar system, then come back with a definitive answer. Oh, yes, there is. Or, oh, no, in fact, there isn't. So if something has a definite factual answer, whether we're aware of that factual answer at the moment or not, to me kind of precludes it from the realm of philosophy, basically, because it's not a question to explore. It's just a question that at the moment we don't have sufficient, as Dr. Spock would say, we do not have sufficient data to compute, sort of thing, yeah. But it is actually a real, genuinely answerable question in the world, which I would say pushes it really outside of philosophical investigation.
I mean, something like, how would discovering that the Earth is not the only planet in the galaxy, etc., with the technology, affect the way we view man, or affect the way we feel, or affect, something like that. So more hypothetical, yeah.
Would beings from such a planet be entitled to the same kind of moral agency as ourselves? Something like that. That would be a philosophical discussion, but just whether it exists or not is simply a matter of, we just need a spaceship and go and look, and then somebody can come back and say, yes, it is, or no, it isn't.
Right, let's move on to the next question. Fasting, what, why, and how to practice it?
Well, it's not being evaluated, so definitely this is not a philosophical question. You're not questioning it, really.
Yeah.
Next question. Is there a real me?
Yes, 100%.
Yes, there is, or not.
Was it 100%
me or just assume me? No, but that is absolutely, that's the kind of philosophical question that's preoccupied philosophers for millennia, basically. It's about identity in the self, and what constitutes the self, whether it's synonymous with the physical body, whether there's some other substance that you might want to call soul, etc. What role does memory and persistence of memory? All of these things are deeply philosophical questions.
I think Dave's been programmed to say that.
Next question, is there such a thing as universal morality?
Definitely philosophical.
You couldn't go around measuring it, you think? You couldn't, like, interview lots of society? No, I'm joking. Does everything have a soul?
Oh, sorry, can I just, sorry, Roger, there. There, for example, the danger, the kind of groups we have often, that a question such as, is there a universal morality, may well degenerate into a discussion as to what is the universal morality. Basically. And that would be a very, rather slightly less philosophical discussion. But whether we can have a notion of universal morality, I think, again, is a deeply, deeply philosophical question.
The trouble is, even the question itself, universal, does it mean universal to all human beings, universal in the universe, universal applicable in all context? It's a perennial question. Yeah.
So next question, does everything have a soul? Question mark.
Well, I hope not, otherwise I have to start being a vegetarian. Yeah, philosophical, I think.
Good.
I had a friend who once was having an interview for a philosophy course, and the lecturer basically said to him, "Why do you want to do philosophy?" He said, "I'm interested in philosophical questions." And they said, "Okay, so would a philosophical question be, for example, is there a God?" And he said, "Yes, there is." That would be a philosophical question. And the lecturer said, "Well, no, basically. Perhaps having a discussion on what we mean by God and what we mean by is, and what we mean by exist, that would be philosophical." So if I was asked that question, does everything have a soul? My first question would be, well, hang on, just define soul, basically. Yeah? Once you've given me some idea about what constitutes an idea of soul, then I can discuss whether everything has one. But just the bald question, does everything have a soul? I mean, it begs the question that such a thing as soul exists. So it might be a philosophical question, but not a particularly well-worded one, I would have thought.
Yeah.
But it seemed to stimulate a philosophical discussion, didn't it? The last question, is universal basic income sustainable?
Interesting, but general, dealing with facts, yeah. I mean, is it morally correct? Is it morally justifiable? Is it...
Yeah, it's worded not to include that kind of thing.
Yeah, so sustainable, it's just a fact, yes or no, really.
But it's probably not a fact. Go on, Ben, do you want to say something on this?
Yeah, I think this is an example of the kind of question I like, actually, which is, and I think the kind of one which works well, which is something which is both kind of, as it were, pure and applied, because this has philosophical aspects and practical aspects. In terms of, well, I mean, actually, no, to be fair, think about it more, it is more practical. That is true.
I think as somebody, if we asked other questions about universal basic income, they might be philosophical, but I'm keeping an eye on my clock here.
Yeah.
Would you like to see what my answers to these are? Right. Very similar to yours, luckily. So climate change general, should we include flora and fauna in an ethical question, philosophical? I thought the one about the technologically advanced civilization was a more general, felt to me more like science fiction. But I think I agree with Dave that the way that you would actually solve that question is empirically rather than through thought alone. The fasting question, I think, is general. Is there a real me? Philosophical. And despite perhaps some of the poor wordings, I think the universal morality and the soul questions are philosophical. I thought universal basic income sustainable was an economics question rather than a philosophical one, but there are philosophical aspects.
Yeah, just to throw in my line again. I mean, I think you made you've made the hard and fast division between the two. I mean, I'd say a lot of questions are a mixture of both, and some of these could easily be turned into crossover questions, like the universal basic income one. You could have something like, is universal basic income desirable or something?
Yes, I agree.
Moral and general, and there'd be psychological, practical, political, economic, and pure ethical things there, and I think that makes for an interesting question.
I agree, Ben, actually. Slightly different question.
You know,
Right.
there is quite,
Roger, if I may say,
Go on, Annie.
yeah. So if I'm thinking according to your definition, and broadly speaking, all of these questions entail both critical thoughts and thinking about thinking. But I do get that there are questions as listed here, and I agree with your classification that, I think similar to what Ben has mentioned, is that, in some of these discussions, you can just be philosophical for the pure sake of being philosophical, yet it does not exclude the philosophy actually coming in to the general questions within the discussion as well. So,
I think some aspects of political philosophy and ethical philosophy are probably more prone to actually needing to be, tied to pragmatic reality than some of the others. But the purpose of this is to give people guidance so they understand. So if I gave more mixed questions, the guidance wouldn't have been so easy, if you see what I mean. I'm going to have to move on just so we don't run out of time. I'll just throw this one open to you all. What is the difference between a debate and discussion?
I'd say that a debate has maybe a yes/no type question. And normally it's more structured in that people speak for and against. And then maybe there's some kind of decision about who's won the debate or which arguments were more convincing in that context. Whereas discussion maybe is more, here's something to talk about, what are your thoughts type thing. It's more in structure.
Yeah, I mean, I'd follow that up by saying, to me, I mean, without, this is certainly not any sort of, this is just me thinking on the hoof, but to me, debates, not necessarily yes, no, but certainly different opinions that might be in conflict then, rather than the yes, no answer. I appreciate that in the way some debates are run, there is that sort of feeling of, and now we will vote on the outcome of the debate. But I also think debate includes that not necessarily in as I say, in direct conflict of each other, but trying to propose different points of view. Whereas I think to me, discussion feels like a more communal teasing apart of ideas.
I'd
as
say
well
that
as expansion. Sorry, Justin. Just
Sorry,
to
I
Annie.
comment-
don't know if Annie, then Justin. Go on, Annie. Do you
Okay,
want to say
thank you.
something?
Just just to follow up with what G has said, I think a discussion also entails expansion of ideas that you've listened to, and you bring in your own viewpoints. It can also be counter ideas you present, but I think for me, a discussion is also building up on previous ideas.
Justin?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what everybody said, really, but I think with a debate, there's also a kind of a stylized element to it, where you have the protagonists who know full well that the question is a complex one, but they deliberately present a simplified version of their argument to present it as forcefully and concisely as possible for an audience. It's not so much for the debaters, it's for the purpose of the audience who might not be familiar with it, and just to give them. So yeah, I agree with.
I mean, often in so-called debating societies, people will, rather like our current Prime Minister, just take a view and experiment with it and see where they can go. Whereas I always see a discussion as people listening to each other, and I think, as Annie said, people building their understanding, hearing what somebody else has said, and hopefully responding to that. And this is, we hope that this is much more of a discussion group. But having said that, there are always going to be elements of debate, and there's not really a hard and fast rule. In fact, rather like most of what we're probably going to say tonight, there's no real hard and fast rules. I'm just pretending there are for the sake of this video. But there we go. Do you mind if I move on to the next topic, just so, I don't want to run out of time, really. Facilitating discussion. So this is quite a few of you, luckily, quite a few of you here have actually been involved in facilitating discussion. But for people who are doing it for the first time, so we encourage people who've posed a question to lead on that question. And perhaps at the start, just take a little bit of time to outline the problems and issues the question addresses. There's no actual requirement for anybody to be in charge in these things, but we have had feedback about some of the discussions being better facilitated than others, and certain misunderstandings about it. So one of the misunderstandings that people think if they've posed the question, it's just a debate with them saying yes or no. And I think what we generally want to encourage is that not that the proposer answers every single comment, but that the comments go around the group so that everybody is included there. And then just a little helpful thing really, which is that particularly for people who are not so used to doing it, that quite a good rule is to limit people to a maximum of 2 minutes of speaking at any one time, as a rule of thumb. But I'm going to welcome contributions from you all for the next just over 5 minutes anyway. Those of you who've experienced facilitation and so on.
I've learned here that the best facilitators are ones like, for example, yourself and Gareth, who ask questions and then step back and let everyone discuss it, and keep the discussion on track by moving people in the right direction and not letting them go off on wild tangents. And it's a whole it's a whole difficult art form if you've got like a largest discussion. To use the hand function and make sure everyone gets a chance to speak. So very well done to you guys.
Can I just say something on, there is some controversy on the hand function, and some of this is to do with the size of the group. So people who've known me know that I actually prefer to keep my eye on people's faces with the little hand up. And that certainly can work in a group of 8 or less, but it seems to me once the groups are 12 or above, that is more difficult. Does anybody else, other people have views on the hands up system?
I think they'd be solved if we could always have the option to have an extra breakout room, which is what we've had before, so that people are not happy with the dynamics to then go to a smaller group. I think the advantage of the hand up system is if it's done well, it's very, very fair. People can get noticed quite more easily than not.
Yeah, I'm an advocate of the hand-up system, basically. I mean,
Sorry, I didn't hear you very clearly. You are in favour or you're not in favour?
yeah, I'm very much in favour of the hands-up system, basically. Yeah, I've tried it both ways, basically, and I've found that the hands-up system works far more effectively. I mean, it does. Obviously, because it massively depends on the group. You get some people who come regularly and they kind of adopt the general sort of mores of the group, and other people might be there for the first time. Some people just dive in and do take quite a combative approach, or they've got one particular idea that they really want to talk about and they just want to bang on about that. And because we don't know each other very well, and because there's no sort of, it's not like a tutorial where you've got a lecturer and students, we're all kind of peers. So it can be quite difficult if you're the facilitator to say, yeah, okay, mate, excuse me, just, yeah, I think you made your point. Yeah. It can become a little bit sort of difficult, whereas with the hands up thing, it basically just keeps things on a more of an even keel, I would have said.
Does anybody have a view on what the difference might be between, so we say, a facilitator and a lecturer, or a facilitator and a moderator, if there is such a thing? Anybody got any views on that?
I think David essentially covered it. It's in terms of, posing questions to keep the conversation going, to ensure that someone's not hogging all of the conversation, or within the discussion, there doesn't emerge a debate with just perhaps 1 or 2 people and everybody's just like in awe of this beautiful argument that's going on. And yes, it's to keep everyone included. And I know personally that I don't like to interrupt people speaking, and therefore I like the hands up and I like to wait for my turn. but I do understand that it is also perhaps contrived and it doesn't let that discussion flow. But then, you know, all of us are not empowered to just get in whenever we feel, or we might, you know, have the inhibition of perhaps offending someone by talking over, and we'd rather just sit back. So I like the hands up as well, but I think it's also dependent on the group numbers in the rooms. But yeah, facilitating as opposed to leading is actually to encourage participation. And lots of people do come here because perhaps, you know, they are, you know, great orators, they speak eloquently and they are so learned, and you want to learn from them and you want to listen to them. But there are those like me who would like to also, you know, perhaps get a bit of encouragement and come in as well. So, you know, the smaller groups work beautifully. And I think your outline of what it is to actually facilitate the question that you pose does cover a lot of the points.
Okay, thanks, Annie. I'm going to have to go on to the next section just in terms of time.
I'd just say one sentence.
Yeah, go on, Ben.
Yeah, I think the point about group size is actually crucial. I think the flow of discussion issue is actually not really to do with hands and things. It's the number of people. In my experience, as the number of people increases above 6, just the quality of discussion deteriorates, because even with the best moderation possible, it just turns into a series of disconnected points, and someone wants to make a point and the conversation moves on, and it's 10 minutes till they get the chance to make their point, etc. So you can't have a flowing discussion. If you know, if there's 12 people, you can't do it. If there's 6, you can. If there's 8, it's pretty borderline. So I very much encourage smaller groups.
Ben, I personally agree with you. But one thing you have said there is about the discussion flowing. And I think what I attempt to do when I'm facilitating is I'm much more interested in the people who listen to others, and I'm much less interested to the people who are basically having a conversation with themselves, which gets me into some trouble sometimes, because quite often the people who are having a conversation with themselves have quite a high opinion of that conversation. But personally, I'm much more interested in the people who appear to me to be listening to the others and are likely to carry on from the point that's been said before, which actually brings us on to the next topic, really, which is participating in discussions, good and bad practice and good and bad argument. And we have 7 minutes on this topic. But what I was going to ask you is, what do you think makes a good participant? I've kind of told you, in my view, you know, the kind of people I want to encourage, the people who look like they're listening, really. And the kind of thing I want to stop is I've come up with an expression which is a conversation black hole, and it could be somebody, Annie might have said, these people are kind of so learned that they could lecture for 15 minutes on something, but they're stopping the conversation actually. And you get others who've got their hobby horse, who everything's about the class war, or everything's about something to do with lobsters or something. And you know, every single discussion you hear the same thing. And I have to say, you know, these are the people that stop the conversation. So I would say the one thing I'm looking for in a participant is somebody who's interested in this discussion flow. But let's hear from you all in the next 6 minutes.
I've got an idea. You can start off by saying, if you can't hear others, you're speaking too much. It'll break the ice.
I think that the best speakers are often quite simply the ones who refer back to previous speakers. You know, as Annie says, I agree with that entirely, but also, now sometimes the problem is, as someone's mentioned, it could be that the point you want to go back to was mentioned 10 minutes before, which does kind of put a bit of bump in the road, but hopefully if it's all relevant to the main conversation, it can go forward. You know, brevity and clarity as far as possible.
But at a personal level, I think people who are open, so they, you know, people who come to the group and who come to a discussion and happy to reflect on something that somebody else. I mean, I appreciate, I'm building on what Roger and David have already said. You know, somebody who doesn't come with a preconceived idea of what they're going to say.
But to be honest with you, I find it it's amazingly educational and disconcerting to come along with an assumption and then have that assumption challenged logically. I mean, I give you an example. I was in another discussion group, and I thought, well, without language, you can't have any thought. And then someone gave an example when you can, and it completely blew my mind because I don't think like that. So it's very educational to realize that there are other valid points of view and to have your assumptions challenged. I think that's the most valuable thing about these debates. And I like the way that the facilitators do challenge us to explain and go forward. It's great.
I think for me, part of the issue is that good philosophy is actually very difficult. And it's tempting to just fall back. Well, I do it, and we all do it, I think, to a degree, to fall back on what you have already, what your default position. But you know that somebody has said something which, as David's just said, which challenges that. But it takes time to formulate a good response to a very, very challenging question. And so when your turn comes to speak, the temptation, well, you often have no choice but to just reiterate what you previously thought. You have to think very, very quickly to be able to come up with a really good answer to the previous speaker, I think, in many cases.
Just so we've only got 2 or 3 minutes left, but one of the things I did want to say is that, what is a good or bad argument? How are we going to do this in 3 minutes? Anybody got any ideas?
I mean, the classic example of appealing to authority is a bad argument, right?
That's good. Yeah.
I think giving examples with options is a brilliant way. Asking questions. Should he do X or Y? I find that very helpful to learn.
Attacking the person is a bad argument.
Yeah.
Would say that, wouldn't you?
Typical, yeah.
And I'm gonna just try and be a little controversial here and sort of come back against David's point is it's actually bad critical thinking to offer 2 options when there are clearly others.
Okay.
Yes.
One of the things I do find is sometimes people who are less well read, shall we say, will quite often say things that are anecdotal in their discussions. Now, the interesting thing about philosophy is, of course, that some philosophy can be personal, anecdotal. I mean, if you're an existentialist, for example, you would often start from the personal, work outwards. But I think there is something about having a logical discussion where you don't say my mum says or my sister says or something. And I've actually heard people say things like that in some of those discussions. So, I mean, hopefully people can learn by osmosis. If they see how people talk around them, they can kind of gain some of those ideas. Now we've got about just over a minute left. Has anybody got anything to say? Anybody who hasn't spoken, who wants to say something, or anybody got anything really strong that they would like to say?
I have spoken, so if somebody else wants to say something, I'll let somebody else go. But I do have something to follow up on that. The interesting thing for me is how do you then commit to that communal pot of ideas if we're trying to, at least in some sense, exclude factual or data-based arguments?
I think I have some sympathy with Ben's overall position, but I think people who are used to doing philosophy will know how to handle data philosophically. And one of the problems is with people who are not used to thinking philosophically. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to wrap up now because, just because we've run out of time. But can I just say thank you very much for everybody. It's actually been a really good session, and I'm very pleased with this. And I'll take a little while and I'll edit it or something and put it on. You'll see it go up on the page. But thanks everybody for contributing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.